introduce Sonja Petek, who's going to present the findings of our annual education survey today. Sonja is a research associate and the project manager for this survey. So please welcome Sonja Petek.
Hi, welcome. Thank you everybody for coming. And I will try to speak loudly for those of you in the back. I know the acoustics in here aren't great. Can you hear me pretty well? Yeah? Okay. Okay. Let me make sure I can advance this properly. Okay, great. Well, the survey this year, thank you for coming. The survey this year is really chock full of questions and some interesting findings. I'm going to try to present the key findings, but I also welcome you to contact me afterward if you have any additional questions or need more information. I'd also like to mention that our website has the full report as well as some online tools that you can use to find some of the survey findings yourself. You can search for questions. You can also run your own crosstabs using an online tool there. So let me start by just mentioning briefly the mission of the PPIC Statewide survey. So we started the survey in 1998, and the idea really was to provide timely, relevant, and nonpartisan information on the social, political, and economic opinions of Californians. And by doing this, we hope to inform the policy debate as well as give a voice to Californians in these debates. And since that time, we've interviewed over 280,000 Californians in 133 surveys. This particular survey, as Dave mentioned, was conducted with funding from a consortium of funders, including the Cabsnell Foundation, the Silver Giving Foundation, and the Stewart Foundation. It's the second year that we've collaborated with these organizations, and we definitely appreciate their support of the survey. This year we really focused heavily on the governor's proposed K-12 funding proposal, and it was very interesting to conduct the survey this year, coming on the heels of the passage of Proposition 30. So we conducted the survey from April 2nd to 9th. It included interviews with about 1,700 Californians. 30% of these interviews were conducted on cell phones. And within the overall sample of Californians, we have a group that we consider likely to vote based on some of their past voting behavior, interest in politics, and that type of thing. So I will mention some key findings among that group. And we also had a sizable group of respondents who have children in the state's K-12 public schools. We had 416 public school parents, so I will also be mentioning some findings among that group. So to begin with, I want to start with some questions that we've been tracking over time. The first question we've been tracking for quite a while. The second question we started asking last year. We found in our survey that nearly half of Californians consider the quality of education to be a big problem in California, and although this is an important finding on its own, it is key to mention that since last year, the percentage saying that educational quality is a big problem has actually gone down by 9 points. We find that a majority, including a majority across parties, across regions and other demographic groups, say that the state budget situation is a big problem for the California's public schools. So despite the fact that Proposition 30 passed and that the economy is somewhat improved, people still recognize that the budget situation is problematic for schools today. However, the percentage considering it a big problem is also down somewhat since last year. Next, I'd like to mention a question that we've been asking since 2007. This question really attempts to get at the debate about whether K-12 public schools are adequately funded or whether more efficient use of the current funds could lead to improvements in K-12 public schools. We ask it as a three-part question to significantly improve the quality of education in California, do we need to use the existing funds we have now more wisely? Do we need to increase the amount of state funding? Or are both of these approaches really needed, both more funding as well as more efficient use of funding? And interestingly, this year, the findings on this question are more similar to what we found before the recession began. So we find that 50% of Californians believe that both of these approaches is needed to improve educational quality, that we need to increase funding and use the existing funding more wisely. This is compared to 39% who believe that simply more efficient use of funds would lead to quality. During the recession, we saw much more divided opinions about this, where people about the same share were saying more efficient use plus the other option of doing both of these things. And like I said, these findings are more similar to 2007. But I think what is important to note, and I think this will be important as we go through the rest of these findings, if you take a look at the percentage who say use funds more wisely, as well as the percentage saying that both things are needed, this really means that most Californians think that we do need to use what we have more wisely, even if we increase the funding. And real quickly, I just want to mention that this is an issue that divides Democrats and Republicans in the state. Democrats are much more likely to favor a dual approach to the problem, whereas Republicans are much more likely to favor more efficient use of funds. Now, I want to get into the governor's proposal. We asked this question about the governor's plan to direct more of the new state funding to districts that have more English learners and lower income students. We first asked this question in January when he first proposed it, and we find that results are largely the same as they were in January. A strong majority of Californians are in favor of this plan. And this is sort of despite lukewarm job approval ratings for the governor, which I'll get into in a bit. But when we look at this a little more deeply, we do see that there's a wide partisan divide in support of the governor's plan. A very strong majority of Democrats express support, while Republicans are divided. And I think it's also interesting that since January, support among both independents and Republicans has declined somewhat, and in fact in January we found that a slim majority of Republicans were expressing support for this idea. I also want to mention that among those we consider likely to vote, support drops to 60%, as you can see on the bar chart on the right there. I also want to briefly mention that if you look at opinion among the groups that would be sort of most affected by this type of proposal, we find that support is very high among lower income Californians, those with household incomes of under $40,000, and support declines somewhat as income rises. And we also find majority support, we do find majority support across racial and ethnic groups, but it's highest among Latinos and African Americans. Now, we also wanted to ask, separate from the governor's actual proposal, we wanted to find out if people are supportive of this general idea of giving extra funds to districts that have more low-income students, and then ask a separate question about giving extra money to districts that have more English learner students. And we find that there's support for the idea of giving districts with more low-income students additional funding, and much lower support for the idea of giving districts with more English learners additional funding. And when we look at this among likely voters, support drops quite a bit for both of the proposals, and in fact, likely voters are opposed to a majority of likely voters are opposed to the idea of giving extra funding to districts with more English learners. One thing that was interesting in the survey, though, is there's been a lot of controversy about who would be the winners and losers under the governor's plan, and whether targeting money in this way will mean less money for districts in, say, suburban areas. So we posed both of these questions more in the context of, if it means less money for other districts, would you favor giving money to districts with low-income students, and then another about the English learners. And we find that support is relatively unchanged. The results are almost the same as this. Now, we also wanted to find out, do Californians think that targeting money in this way will actually help the state make strides to closing the persistent achievement gap between disadvantaged students and other students? So we found that when we asked respondents if the state were to give extra funding to those districts with the neediest students, do you think that the academic achievement of these students will improve? And we found that 74% say that the academic achievement will improve at least somewhat. A third say it would improve a lot. And just 1 in 5 don't think that targeting money in this way would help the academic achievement. We find, not surprising, that supporters of the governor's plan, almost 9 in 10 think that it would result in improvements. And we also wanted to find out, so if the state were to do this, do people think that this money would be spent wisely by the local school districts? We find that just over half of Californians think that if local districts were given extra money because of their shares of lower income and English learners, just over half are very or somewhat confident that these districts could spend the money wisely. Just 15%, however, are very confident in this. And we find that public school parents feel similarly, with a little more than half saying that they're confident about this. When we look at this question by party, you can see Democrats are more optimistic than Republicans when it comes to their confidence in local school districts. The other major component of Governor Brown's plan is this idea of giving increased flexibility to local school districts by doing away with many of the categorical programs that existed before. And since 2008, we've been asking this question about who they prefer have the most control over how to spend state funding at the local schools. And we found consistently high support for the idea, consistently high support for local school districts or local schools themselves to have the most control over these spending decisions. Very few say that they would prefer the state to have the most control. And this preference for local control is really shared across the board throughout the state, across parties, across regions, across age, education, income, racial, ethnic groups, etc. And then when we ask, well, would you favor or oppose giving local school districts more flexibility over how to spend state funding, overwhelming majority of Californians favor this idea. And we found the same level of support last April. We posed a similar question to the one about targeting funding to the neediest students. In this case, we asked, how confident are you in your local school districts to spend the money wisely if they're given more flexibility over the use of state funds? And on this measure, we find a fairly high level of confidence in the local school districts to spend money wisely. Again, not so many saying that they're very confident, but if you look at the very and somewhat confident together, it's a pretty large majority. We asked this question in January and last April and found similar levels of confidence in their local school districts. There's been some ongoing discussion in the legislature about ways to tinker with Proposition 13. One of the topics under discussion is whether the vote threshold to pass parcel taxes for local public schools should be lowered from 2/3 to 55%. And so I'd like to start by talking about the pie chart on the right. So we asked Californians, do you think that it's a good idea or a bad idea to lower the vote threshold to pass parcel taxes to 55%? And among likely voters, we find opinion is divided between good idea and bad idea. And if you look at the overall sample of all Californians, just a very slim majority think that it's a good idea to lower the threshold in this way. a similar percentage in January, a similar percentage of likely voters considered this a good idea. And when we first started asking the question in 2009, we did find a lower level of support for the idea of lowering the threshold. At that time, 40% considered it a good idea. We do find opinion is sharply divided along party lines when it comes to lowering the vote threshold. And among the group of independents, they are also divided. We also posed a question about how they would vote on a parcel tax if there were a parcel tax for local schools on their local ballot measure. And we find that 51% of likely voters say they would vote yes, and this obviously falls well below the 2/3 vote that would be required to pass a parcel tax. As I mentioned before, the governor received somewhat lukewarm job approval ratings. 46% say they approve, and approval is actually much lower for his handling of K-12 public schools. What's interesting about this, the governor got a bit of a bump in his approval ratings after the fall elections. We had a record high 51% saying they approved in January. It declined somewhat since then to 46%, but it is slightly higher than when we first took this measure in April 2011. And I think what's interesting here is that despite the efforts that he's made in the area of K-12 education, we actually find more Californians disapproving than approving of his job performance in this area. Even among Democrats, fewer than half approve of the way he's handled K-12 public schools. The legislature receives fairly low job approval ratings, both on their job overall as well as on their handling of K-12 public education, but you can see that this has improved. Approval ratings have actually doubled since 3 years ago. Still, what this chart doesn't display are the approval ratings from January. We also saw a little bump in approval there. In January, 41% said they approved of the job performance overall. The survey included several questions about some of the challenges facing the state's K-12 public education system, and we've been tracking these questions for a number of years. On each of these, the high school dropout rate, student achievement, and teacher quality, we find that majorities of Californians consider them to be at least somewhat of a problem. But when you look at the share saying big problem, you can see they're much more likely to say this about the high school dropout rate than either student achievement or teacher quality. And you can see here that since 2011, we have seen a decline in the percentage saying that these issues are big problems. And we've noticed this in a number of the questions in the survey this year, that although people are very concerned about the K-12 system and are concerned about budget implications and financing, there are some small glimmers of hope compared to recent years' surveys. And this would be one case. There's fewer people are perceiving that some of these things are as big of a problem. I wanted to mention that importantly on the dropout rate, which as we all know disproportionately affects Latino and African American students as well as lower income students, the shares of African American and Latinos in our survey and lower income residents saying these are big problems is much higher than among others. We also wanted to measure concerns about some of the inequity issues facing the state's K-12 public schools. One of the questions we asked about was, how concerned are you that students in lower income areas are less likely to be ready for college when they finish high school? We find that majorities are at least somewhat concerned, and even 56% of Californians are very concerned about this issue. But you can see that the shares who are very concerned are much higher among African Americans and Latinos. We also find that Democrats are much more likely to be very concerned than Republicans or independents. We have found that since 2007, when we first asked this question, we found similarly high levels of concern among Californians. When it comes to the shortage of good teachers in lower income areas, we find that just over half of Californians say they are very concerned. Another 30% say they are somewhat concerned. But this may be another sign that Californians are thinking the situation is a little bit better this year. Last April, when we asked this question, the percentage of Californians who were very concerned was 12 points higher. And these findings are actually more like the findings that we had before the recession began. Again, however, you can see that African Americans are among the most likely to be very concerned, and about 6 in 10 Latinos and Asians are also very concerned. A third issue that we asked about is the fact that English language learners score lower on standardized tests than other students. We find close to half of Californians say they're very concerned about this issue. And on this question, we again find that concern is somewhat lower than last year. Latinos and African Americans are more likely than Asians and whites to be very concerned about English learner test scores. To put California in context with other states, we asked respondents how they would compare the state's level of per pupil spending to other states and how they would compare the state's student test scores to other states. We found that just 36% of Californians are aware that our per pupil spending is below average or near the bottom. And when we first started asking this question as far back as the late 90s, at that time, Californians were more likely to say that the state's per pupil spending was below average. We find that nearly half are aware that the state's student test scores are lower than average, and these findings have been fairly consistent over time. When we take these two questions and look at them together, we find that only about 1 in 4 Californians, likely voters, or public school parents are aware that both our per pupil spending is lower than average and that our student test scores are lower than average. So in light of this idea of doing away with many of the state's categorical programs, we wanted to find out how important Californians think some of the state's programs and goals are. And I want to go a bit out of order on this. I want to start with career technical or vocational education. This is one of the categorical programs that people are wanting to still somehow provide funding for. And we find that nearly all Californians consider it at least somewhat important to include career technical education as part of the school curriculum. 3 in 4 consider it very important. And we find that solid majorities across the board consider this to be important. And this level of importance has been consistently high since we first started asking this question in 2007. Another of the categorical programs that has provoked some controversy is the K-3, kindergarten through 3rd grade class size reduction funding. And we find that a strong majority of Californians consider K-3 class size reduction to be at least somewhat important, but it's a slim majority consider it very important. And then on the other two goals that we asked about, we find that an overwhelming majority consider it very important to prepare students for college. And this is, really the goal of the state's A to G requirements, and the public seems to also consider this to be an important priority. And like career tech, the findings on this question have been consistently high over time as well. And then this year we asked a new question on the importance of including civics education as part of the curriculum. And we find that just over half consider this to be very important. And one of the things I thought was interesting, but I guess not too surprising, was that the state's youngest residents were the least likely to say civics was very important, and those aged 35 and older were more likely to place importance on civics. And then when we look at our group of public school parents, they consider all 4 of these to be very important at a higher level than others. We also wanted to find out how Californians view the role of K-12 schools generally. So we asked them, what do you consider the most important goal of the state's K-12 public schools to be? And then we gave them a list of options. And the list included preparing students for college, preparing students for jobs in the workforce, teaching students the basics, teaching students life skills, or preparing students to be good citizens. We find that a plurality, 35%, say that college preparation is the most important goal of the K-12 public schools. We found this to be true in the 3 other times we asked this question, starting in 2006. But there are big differences, as you can see on this chart. Those with historically less access to the college system see college preparation as the most important goal. And public school parents, nearly half, would consider college preparation to be the top priority. Latinos and African Americans, much more likely than whites or Asians to say this. And we also find the same to be true among those with lower incomes and those with only high school educations or less. They're much more likely to place emphasis on college preparation. Each year we ask residents to grade their own local K-12 public schools. And consistent with previous years, we find that just over half of Californians would give their local schools a grade of A or B. 27% would give their schools a C, and only 14% would give a D or F. And you can see the results don't fluctuate too much across regions. Everybody is fairly positive about their local public schools. And we did think it was interesting. There's an annual poll that's conducted nationally by Phi Delta Kappa Gallup, and their most recent poll was from June 2012. And the results, they also asked people to grade their local public schools, and the results were almost identical on the A to F spectrum, which I thought was interesting. But this question, which sort of gets at the adequacy piece of the puzzle, we do find that a pretty solid majority of Californians and even more public school parents say that the level of state funding for their local public schools is not enough. And African Americans and Latinos in particular believe that funding is inadequate. We found an identical share of Californians last April saying that local school funding levels were not enough. And by region, we find that majorities say funding is not enough, but this is highest in the Inland Empire and lowest in Orange, San Diego counties. Now, given some of the conversations going on about the student testing system, as well as the amount of testing at both the elementary, middle, and high school levels, we wanted to ask some questions about how residents perceived the state's testing system. First, in a question that's not displayed here, we asked Californians how confident they are that standardized tests are an accurate measure of a student's progress and abilities. We found that 53% of Californians say that they are very or somewhat confident that tests are an accurate indicator of a student's progress, but this is down 10 points since we first asked this question in 2006. So basically people today are slightly less confident that tests are really a good indicator of a student's abilities. And then when we asked about the amount of testing, both at the elementary and middle school level and then at the high school level, we find actually that pluralities of Californians think that the amount of testing is the right amount. Just over 20% consider it to be too much, and about 3 in 10 say that it's not enough. Another issue that we wanted to include in the survey this year is teacher evaluation, which has been an important issue at both the state and national level. We asked about 3 factors that could be included in teacher evaluation. 1, student achievement as measured by standardized tests. Another, the academic improvement of students as measured by standardized tests. And then a third one we included was classroom observations by principals or other experts. We found that all 3 of these ideas were very popular with Californians, and this really holds true across parties, regions, and demographic groups. But the idea of using classroom observations was definitely the most popular option across the spectrum. And there is bipartisan support for each of these ideas. And then we asked a fourth question about whether Californians think that the state should require all districts to use a common framework to evaluate teachers, or whether they think that each district should develop its own process for evaluating teachers. We find opinions pretty divided on this. 51% think the state should provide a framework, 47% think the districts should be developing their own process. Among public school parents, 6 in 10 prefer the common statewide framework. Now finally, I want to mention some special questions that we asked among public school parents. We began asking this question as the recession was really taking hold in 2009. We began asking public school parents whether they had noticed cuts at their child's public school as a result of the state budget situation, and we've found strong majorities since 2009 have said that their child's school has been affected a lot or somewhat by budget cuts. And that's also true this year, 40% saying a lot, 34% saying somewhat. But you can see here that Latino public school parents are twice as likely as white parents to say that their child's school has been affected a lot. And oh, that wasn't actually on the chart, so you couldn't see that. But it's true. Latino parents much more likely to have noticed budget cuts at their child's public school, and the same holds true across income groups, where the lower income public school parents are more likely to have noticed budget cuts. We also asked public school parents what they hope will be the highest grade that their child will achieve. And since we started asking this question in 2005, we found that most public school parents really want their child to go to college or get a postgraduate degree. And you can see here that across the spectrum, across the income and racial and ethnic spectrum, parents want their child to at least get a 4-year degree. But there are some interesting differences. White parents are 3 times as likely as Latino public school parents to hope their child achieves a graduate degree. And you can see the pattern across income groups as well, with those earning more wanting their child to attend graduate school. And I think these findings are really interesting because they sort of shed some light on the role or the perceived role of the state's K-12 public education system. So for example, when I took a look at the Latino public school parents, 60% in that group say that the primary goal of the state's K-12 education system should be college preparation. When I look at this same question among the white public school parents, only 25% say that the primary goal of the state schools should be college preparation. They're as likely to say that life skills should be the most important goal. And yet white parents are the most likely to want advanced degrees for their children. So I really think what this is potentially saying is that among Latinos, the K-12 schools really play an essential role in getting their kids to college, whereas among white parents it may be more of a given that they're going to send their kids to college. And then I want to briefly mention, we had a few other questions for public school parents. We wanted to find out if they were confident that they had the resources and information to help their child achieve these educational goals. And we find that most parents are at least somewhat confident in their resources and information, but white parents and higher income are more likely to be very confident. We also asked a third question: are you confident that your local public schools have the resources and information to help your child achieve these educational levels? And we find that about 1 in 5 are very confident in their local public schools, and then a pretty big share are at least somewhat confident. And then finally, I'll just mention, we wanted to see, as the state's getting ready to roll out the Common Core state standards, we wanted to find out how many public school parents had actually heard about these standards. and we found 54% saying they had heard nothing about Common Core state standards, and this was similar across racial, ethnic, and income groups, which I thought was interesting. Perhaps next year after they've taken effect, this will change, I'm not sure. So just to briefly conclude, I want to just hit on some of the key findings again from the survey. 7 in 10 favor the governor's plan to target money to the state's neediest students, and 8 in 10 favor the idea of increasing local flexibility. We find only a slim majority of Californians and even fewer likely voters support the idea of lowering the vote to 55% to pass parcel taxes. And we find that more than 6 in 10 say that funding levels at their local public schools are inadequate. And public school parents continue to notice budget cuts at their child's public school. So with that, I welcome any questions you have about the survey.